The night jasmine was in full bloom. Its scent drifted thick and sweet through the long corridor of the Ravenscar townhouse, curling through every gaslit hallway, settling over the laughter and champagne and the swell of a 30-piece string orchestra performing somewhere in the grand ballroom below. 300 guests had come. Earls, industrialists, shipping magnates, women draped in diamonds borrowed and inherited, men whose signatures alone could shift the price of steel across 2 continents. They had all come to celebrate the most anticipated wedding the English-speaking world had seen in a generation. Tomorrow morning, at precisely 11 o'clock, inside the soaring stone arches of St. George's Chapel, Aurora Ravenscar was going to become a duchess. Tonight, she was going to discover that her entire life had been a carefully engineered lie. She slipped away from the rehearsal ball just before midnight, not because she was tired, not because the champagne had gone flat, or the conversation had grown stale. She left because she had not seen Duke Lucien Vane, her fiancé, the man she had spent 6 months building a future with for nearly 2 hours. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself he had simply been pulled into one of those interminable political discussions that men with ancient titles and empty bank accounts loved to have at other people's parties. She told herself a great many things that would all turn out to be wrong. The east wing of the townhouse was dark. Only the silver wash of moonlight through the tall, arched windows lit her path, and the music from the ballroom faded to something distant and soft, a ghost of a waltz as her satin slippers moved silently along the Persian runner. She passed the private library. She passed the portrait gallery where her late mother's face watched from a gilded frame with knowing, watchful eyes. She rounded the corner toward the glass-domed conservatory, the one her father, Lord Edward Ravenscar, had built to indulge her mother's obsession with winter camellias. She heard voices first. Low, urgent, intimate. One of them she recognized instantly. She stopped. She pressed herself against the cool gilded wall partition beside the mahogany doors, and through the gap where the heavy doors had not been fully pulled shut, she saw them. Duke Lucien Vane, tall, golden-haired, dressed in the dark navy evening coat she had helped him select, had her cousin Genevieve pressed against the conservatory's marble pillar. His hands were buried in Genevieve's golden updo. His mouth was over hers with a desperate, hungry certainty he had never once shown Aurora in 6 months of courtship. Genevieve, in her shimmering lavender ball gown, had her gloved arms wrapped around his shoulders as though she had been holding him there for years, as though this were theirs, as though Aurora's whole magnificent life were merely scenery in a story she did not own. And then, glittering at Genevieve's throat in the cold shaft of moonlight, Aurora saw it, the Ravenscar diamond, her mother's necklace, the piece that had sat locked in Aurora's private vault since that very morning. Aurora did not scream. She did not move. She stood in the shadow of that corridor, and she listened. And what she heard was so much worse than the kiss. Because I genuinely need to know. Thank you so much for being here. It truly means the world to me. This channel lives and breathes because of your support. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us. Smash that like, and drop a comment right now telling us where you are watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is reaching. It helps more than you will ever know. All right, thank you. Now let us get back to Aurora. Spring of 1888 arrived in London like a debt collector at a front door, persistent, impossible to ignore, and extraordinarily well-dressed. For most of the city it meant longer days, flower markets overflowing at Covent Garden, and the soft return of green to the parks. For Aurora Ravenscar, it meant 6 separate appointments with a Belgian lace artisan, 40 revised seating charts, and the constant, pleasant thunder of society columnists printing her name in proximity to the words, Wedding of the Century. She was 37 years old, and she was not accustomed to being the center of a fairy tale. She was accustomed to being the center of a boardroom. Lord Edward Ravenscar, her father, her North Star, the architect of everything the family owned, had built his fortune the unromantic way. Iron and rails, steel mills in Birmingham and Newcastle, a transatlantic shipping concern that, by 1882, was moving more freight tonnage out of Liverpool than any enterprise not owned by the Crown. He had started with nothing but an engineer's mind, his late wife's unwavering faith, and a compulsive refusal to be told what was impossible. By the time Aurora was 20, the Ravenscar name commanded more financial deference in a London boardroom than most hereditary titles. By the time she was 30, she was running 2 divisions of the company herself. But money, in Victorian England, was a language that old aristocracy spoke only reluctantly. The Ravenscars were what the drawing rooms of Mayfair called new money, spoken in the same tone one might use to describe a stain on a tablecloth. Beautiful, impressive, perhaps, but not quite right. Lord Edward had not built an empire only to watch it be dismissed at the door of history. He wanted legitimacy, the kind that came not from balance sheets, but from bloodlines. He wanted a title in the family. Enter Duke Lucien Vane, the Duke of Westland. Lucien Vane was, by every outward measure, exactly what the social architects of the era designed as the perfect English aristocrat. He was 32. He was tall, with the kind of chiseled jaw and effortless bearing that centuries of selective European marriage had conspired to produce. He had golden hair that caught the light at every social function as if it had been trained to do so. His conversation was quick and genuinely funny. His manners were flawless. He could quote Tennyson, ride a horse with the ease of someone born in a saddle, and charm a room of cynical industrialists inside of 10 minutes. What the society papers failed to mention, because the society papers were not paid to mention, it was that the House of Westland was broken. Spectacularly, almost impressively broken. Lucien's grandfather had gambled away most of the family fortune during a particularly catastrophic decade at the card tables of Monte Carlo. His father had finished the rest. The ancestral Westland estate in Wiltshire required repairs that would cost a small fortune, and the creditors, who had been patiently circling the dukedom for 4 years, were beginning to lose their patience. Lord Edward's solicitors had discovered this within a week of Lucien's first introduction to the family. Lord Edward had considered it, and decided it was workable. A title for a fortune for a title, the oldest arrangement in English history, dressed up in silk and rose petals, and called a love match. The problem, the one that none of them had planned for, was that Aurora had fallen genuinely, entirely, and without reservation in love with Lucien Vane. He had been so extraordinarily good at being lovable. He had sent her rare white orchids imported from the south of France with handwritten notes that said things like, "A flower that refuses to be ordinary, for a woman who has never been anything less." He had arrived at her father's offices one afternoon simply to take her to tea, unannounced and unhurried, as though her company were the only appointment that mattered. He listened when she talked about logistics and shipping routes and quarterly projections, and he did not glaze over the way lesser men did. He asked questions. He laughed at the right moments. He put his hand over hers at dinner tables and looked at her with a warmth that felt entirely, devastatingly real. 6 months of that, and Aurora Ravenscar, who had never been foolish about anything in her professional life, was thoroughly, helplessly fooled. She threw herself into the wedding preparations with the same exactitude she brought to a contract negotiation. The gown took 4 seamstresses and 11 weeks ivory silk underlaid with antique Brussels lace, the sleeves a delicate tracery of needle and thread that required a magnifying glass to fully appreciate. She personally approved every floral arrangement, every menu course, every line of the seating chart for the 400 guests who would fill St. George's Chapel. She stayed up past midnight reviewing vendor contracts. She sent back the first 3 proofs of the invitation cards because the engraving was not sharp enough. Through all of it, Genevieve Montgomery was there. Genevieve was Aurora's first cousin, the only child of Aurora's mother's younger brother, who had died of consumption in 1876 along with his wife, leaving 19-year-old Genevieve destitute and entirely alone in the world. Aurora had brought her into the Ravenscar household without a second thought. She had given her the finest education her money could provide, a generous monthly allowance, a prominent place in every social engagement. She had treated Genevieve not as a poor relation to be tolerated, but as a sister to be cherished. Genevieve was 29 now. She was, in the way of a certain kind of beauty, unforgettable fair-skinned, with wide, long-lashed eyes and spun gold hair that she wore in elaborate, shimming updos adorned with hairpieces. She dressed beautifully and spoke softly, and had a talent for appearing precisely as fragile and grateful and sweet as any situation required. She was Aurora's chosen maid of honor. Love, as any good solicitor will tell you, is the single most reliable instrument for making an intelligent person overlook what is directly in front of them. The inconsistencies had been there for weeks. Aurora would discover this later, in the cold, sober aftermath of conservatory, when she sat in her father's private study and replayed every small oddity with the detachment of a detective rather than a bride. Lucien had missed 4 of their scheduled afternoon rides in the 3 weeks before the wedding. Each time, he sent a brief, apologetically worded note of urgent estate business, a meeting with his solicitors in the city, once a vague reference to personal matters requiring my full attention. Aurora had accepted all of it without question. He was a duke with a crumbling estate to manage. Of course there were complications. Of course there were meetings. What she had not asked, and should have, was who precisely he was meeting. Genevieve, too, had developed a new pattern of disappearances. Hours gone in the afternoon running errands for the wedding, she said, or visiting the modiste for final alterations to her maid of honor gown. Aurora, neck deep in floral invoices and seating configurations, had thought nothing of it. Of course Genevieve was busy. The wedding was in days. There was one other thing, and this one she had noticed and then deliberately not thought about. The way one notices a loose thread on a favorite dress and decides not to pull it. The Ravenscar diamond had been moved. It was her mother's necklace, a pear-cut central stone of extraordinary quality, surrounded by a constellation of smaller stones in a platinum setting that her father had commissioned in 1861 as an anniversary gift. Aurora had always kept it in her private vault, and she had planned to wear it on her wedding day as the only piece of her mother she could still carry close. 3 days before the rehearsal ball, she had gone to the vault to try the necklace against the gown and found the velvet box sitting in the wrong position, not at the back of the drawer, where she always kept it, but moved slightly to the front, as if someone had picked it up and set it back in haste. She had told herself the housemaid must have moved it while cleaning. She had told herself a great many things that week. On the morning of the rehearsal ball, the necklace was gone entirely. Aurora turned the vault out completely. She questioned the household staff with careful, measured calm. She checked her dressing room, her bedchamber, the sitting room where she sometimes worked in the evenings. Nothing. The necklace had vanished. She had reported its absence to the household's head of security and told herself it would turn up. Valuables had a way of being misplaced in the chaos before large events. That night, at the rehearsal ball, wearing her emerald green velvet gown and her most impenetrable social smile, she had told herself one last time that everything was fine. It was not fine. It had not been fine for quite some time. Lucien had been distant all evening. Not rudely, so he was far too good at the performance for that. He had danced the obligatory waltz with her, his hand correct and light at her waist, his smile perfect, but his eyes kept moving, over her shoulder, toward the doorway, toward a fixed point somewhere in the beautiful, glittering room that was not her. He made his excuses at 10 o'clock, citing a headache brought on by the champagne, and disappeared somewhere into the labyrinthine corridors of the townhouse. By midnight, the ballroom had begun to feel suffocating. Aurora set her glass down on a passing footman's tray and went to find him, not dramatically, not with any particular alarm, simply because she was tired and the evening was winding down, and she wanted, just for a moment, for him to hold her hand and tell her that tomorrow was going to be worth every exhausting, beautiful thing she had put into it. She moved through the east wing corridors alone. She heard the voices. She looked through the crack of the mahogany doors, and there it was, the whole hidden architecture of the last 6 months, fully and horrifyingly revealed. She did not move. She barely breathed. The scent of the conservatory's blooming camellias, her mother's flowers, the ones Lord Edward still tended faithfully every winter, drifted through the cracked mahogany door like an accusation. Genevieve broke the kiss first, gasping softly, pressing her forehead against Lucien's chest as his arms kept their fierce, proprietary hold around her waist. In the cold moonlight, slanting through the glass dome above them, Aurora could see the Ravenscar diamond glittering at Genevieve's throat settled against the skin of her neck. with the easy familiarity of something that had been worn many times before in private. "We are taking too great a risk," Genevieve whispered. Her voice was unlike any version of Genevieve that Aurora had ever known. It was not fragile. It was not sweet. It was low and dark and thrumming with a particular kind of excitement that had nothing to do with fear. "Let her come looking," Lucien said. His hand moved to Genevieve's jaw, tilting her face upward. The tenderness in that gesture, the absolute, unhurried certainty of it was something he had never once directed at Aurora in 6 months. "By tomorrow evening, the parish registry will carry both our signatures. Every railway share her father transferred into the Westland accounts 3 days ago will be legally untouchable. The dukedom is saved, Josie. Everything we worked for." "And me," Genevieve said, a small, practiced pout settling at the corner of her mouth. "Am I to go on playing the devoted cousin while you install that merchant's daughter as your Duchess?" Lucien laughed, and it was a sound Aurora had never heard from him before. Low and cold and private. The laugh of a man whose charm was a coat he put on and took off at will. "You know where my heart has always been," he said, "since that first weekend in Sussex 3 summers ago. Aurora is a transaction, nothing more. She will be settled at the Westland country estate in Wiltshire quietly, comfortably, out of sight. She will believe she is a duchess living in magnificent isolation. You and I will have Paris, Rome, Vienna, everything." A beat of silence. Then Lucien's voice dropped to something so coldly matter-of-fact that it cut through the night air like a blade through silk. "The countryside is notoriously unforgiving for careless horsewomen. A year, perhaps 2. Grief is so very respectable in a young widower. And once I have full legal control of the estate, under the inheritance frameworks her own father's solicitors drew up." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Aurora stood in the dark of the corridor for approximately 4 seconds after those words settled over her. For seconds in which everything she thought she knew about her own life rearranged itself into something unrecognizable and terrible and absolutely, completely clear. She did not scream. She did not push through those mahogany doors and tear the crystal from the walls of her own conservatory. She did not dissolve, and she did not flee. She would have been forgiven for any of those responses. Any reasonable person would have been forgiven. The man she loved was kissing her cousin in her mother's conservatory while wearing her mother's stolen diamonds and calmly outlining the timeline for her own murder. But Aurora Ravenscar was not, ultimately, a woman who fell apart. She was her father's daughter, and Lord Edward Ravenscar had not built a shipping empire by breaking under pressure. She took exactly one slow, measured breath. She stepped back from the door. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown with both gloved hands, the way she smoothed a document before signing it, and she turned and walked quietly, purposefully, at precisely the pace of a woman who had somewhere important to be back toward the light and noise of the ballroom. Her face was composed. Her eyes were clear. Her mind was moving at a speed that would have frightened anyone who knew what was happening inside it. By the time she re-entered the ballroom, she had the first 12 steps of a plan. By the time she located James Miller across the room, standing near the fireplace with a glass of brandy and the watchful stillness of a man who was always, on some level, working, she was 20. She caught his eye. She gave the smallest possible nod toward the corridor. James Miller set down his glass. Lord Edward Ravenscar's private study smelled of old mahogany, coal smoke, and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco he had given up 3 years prior at Aurora's insistence. The bookshelves were lined with legal volumes, engineering texts, and bound reports that had the worn, dog-eared look of documents actually consulted rather than decoratively arranged. A large walnut desk dominated the center of the room, its surface ordered with the precision of a man who understood that clarity of mind begins with clarity of space. Aurora locked the double doors behind her and James Miller and stood in the center of the Persian rug, and for precisely the length of one breath allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she now knew. Then she put away, folded it up, set it somewhere in the back of her chest, and sealed it. There would be time for grief. Later. After. "He has been sleeping with Josephine," she said. Her voice was stripped entirely clean. No trembling, no performance of composure. Just the flat, metallic statement of a fact that needed to be managed. They are in my mother's conservatory now. They have been involved for at least 3 years. He referenced a weekend in Sussex in the summer of 1885. Tonight I overheard them confirm the following. My father's railway share transfer to the Westland accounts, approximately £100,000, is the specific objective. Once the wedding is legally completed and the funds are unreachable, I am to be relocated to the Westland estate in Wiltshire. Within 1 to 2 years, an arranged riding accident is intended to remove me permanently, leaving Lucien a widower with full inheritance rights under the terms of our marital property agreement. James Miller did not gasp. He did not offer condolences, which was one of the things Aurora had always valued about him. He simply set both hands flat on the edge of Lord Edward's desk and looked at her with the focused, calculating attention of a man assembling a legal case in real time. The railway shares were transferred 3 days ago, he said. I had confirmation from Coutts and Company on Thursday. Can we recover them? A short pause. Then, not all recovery is impossible depending entirely on whether the escrow covenant your father and I structured is still operative. Aurora looked at him very carefully. Explain that to me. James Miller straightened, and what followed was one of the most important legal education lessons Aurora Ravenscar would ever receive, delivered at midnight in her father's study, while a string orchestra played distantly, and 300 guests finished the champagne below. Under the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, James explained, a woman entering marriage retained the right to own and control her own property independently of her husband, a revolutionary piece of British legislation that had, for the first time in English legal history, given women legal standing over their own assets within a marriage. Prior to 1882, a woman's property had merged entirely into her husband's legal identity upon marriage, leaving her with no independent financial standing whatsoever. The act had changed that, at least on paper. However, Lord Edward Ravenscar, being a man of extraordinary legal caution, had gone considerably further than the act required. Knowing that the Duke of Westland's creditors were circling, he had structured the entire £100,000 dowry transfer under an escrow covenant, a legal instrument that placed the funds in a protected holding status, physically present in the Westland accounts at Coutts, but legally encumbered by conditions that had to be satisfied before the money became the Duke's to touch. The condition was specific. The transfer only became final and irrevocable at the moment both Aurora and Lucien physically signed the parish marriage registry, in the presence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, completing the legal formalization of the union. Until that ink touched that parchment, the £100,000 legally remained the property of Lord Edward Ravenscar. So if the marriage does not complete, Aurora said, every pound reverts, with interest and with full legal standing to pursue damages for the fraudulent misrepresentation that induced the transfer in the first place. James Miller allowed himself the smallest possible smile. Your father did not trust the Duke's financial history. He was, as it turns out, correct not to. The silence in the study was absolute. Somewhere below, the orchestra began a new piece. I am not going to cancel the wedding, Aurora said. James stared at her. I am not going to send a note to the Archbishop. I am not going to take to my bed with a convenient illness. I am not going to give Lucien any signal whatsoever that anything in this world has changed. She moved to the desk. He spent 6 months engineering this. He walked into my father's house, ate at our table, sent me flowers from the continent, and planned my murder before I had chosen my wedding shoes. I will not give him a quiet exit. I will not give him a polite, private conclusion that allows him to dust himself off and find another heiress by autumn. I want him destroyed, publicly, completely, and in front of every person in England with the social power to ensure he never recovers. James Miller was quiet for a long moment. Then we need Scotland Yard, he said. Aurora nodded once. The necklace. Genevieve is currently wearing the Ravenscar diamond, my late mother's piece, valued in excess of £40,000, which she removed from my locked vault. That is grand larceny. I want her arrested on the floor of the chapel. Chief Inspector Thomas, James said immediately. He owes your father a considerable professional debt from the railway strike negotiations last October. I can reach him tonight. Do it. I want plainclothes officers at every transept. I want the bank representatives from Coutts and Company in the congregation. I want everything in place before the first guest is seated tomorrow morning." Aurora stood. She looked at James Miller with the same steady clarity she brought to closing a contract worth 7 figures. "Lucien believes tomorrow is the day he wins everything he worked for. I intend to let him believe that right up until the moment he discovers he has lost everything he ever had." James Miller pulled his gold pocket watch from his waistcoat. It was 10 minutes past 1 in the morning. "I'll have Chief Inspector Thomas on the telephone within the hour," he said. "Good." Aurora moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the brass handle. "James, not a word to my father until it is done. I do not want him to spend the night in a state I cannot manage." "Of course." "Thank you." She said it simply, without excess, "for everything you built into that covenant." He gave her a small, respectful nod. She opened the door and walked back into the corridor, her spine perfectly straight, her expression perfectly serene, the whole extraordinary engine of her mind running at full throttle in perfect, invisible silence. Upstairs, in the conservatory, Genevieve and Lucien did not know that the trap had just been set. London woke on the morning of the wedding to the kind of May sunshine that feels almost deliberately cruel in its beauty, warm and gold, and entirely unbothered by human suffering. Aurora had not slept. She had not expected to. She had spent the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning sitting at her writing desk in her dressing gown, not writing anything, simply thinking with the deliberate, systematic thoroughness she brought to every problem that mattered. She had reviewed the plan from 14 different angles. She had identified 5 points at which it could unravel and neutralized 4 of them through instructions passed to James by a handwritten note delivered at 6 in the morning. The 5th is the possibility that Lucien might grow suspicious before the ceremony she could not control, and so she simply accepted it and moved past it. One could not eliminate every variable. One could only be better prepared than the opposition. At 7, her lady's maids arrived. At 7:30, she was seated at her vanity in the ivory dressing gown she had selected specifically for this morning, and 4 skilled hands began the intricate work of pinning her dark hair into the deep, sweeping Victorian coiffure that would anchor the diamond tiara. A Ravenscar tiara is one of her grandmother's pieces, not her mother's, because the Ravenscar diamond would not, today, be worn by its rightful owner. That was fine. Today, the diamond would serve a different purpose entirely. The door opened at 8:15, and Genevieve floated in. She wore her maid of honor gown, a pale lavender chiffon with intricate shimmering embroidery throughout the voluminous skirt, a delicate off-shoulder neckline, and a silk sash at the waist. She looked, as she always looked when the occasion required it, like the very definition of gentle, devoted femininity. Her golden hair was already dressed. Her wide eyes were bright with what appeared to be genuine, uncomplicated joy. She was wearing, beneath the high lace insert of the gown's neckline, a faint but unmistakable outline that Aurora's sharp eyes located immediately. The Ravenscar diamond, against her skin. To the chapel, Aurora kept her face entirely neutral and turned back to her reflection. "Oh, Jenny," Genevieve breathed, clasping her gloved hands together as she looked at the bride in the mirror. "You look like something out of a painting. Lucien is going to be completely undone when he sees you." "Do you think so?" Aurora asked pleasantly. "I do hope the day goes exactly as everyone expects." Genevieve stepped forward to adjust the edge of Aurora's lace veil, her fingers deft and practiced. She was very good at this. She had always been very good at appearing to give while quietly talking. "I noticed you are not wearing your mother's necklace," she said lightly. "I thought you had planned to." "I changed my mind," Aurora said, meeting Genevieve's eyes in the glass with a gaze so steady and warm it was almost hypnotic. "I decided to keep it locked away safely. Some things are too precious to risk losing." Something moved behind Genevieve's expression, a fast, almost imperceptible flicker, like a candle in a momentary draught. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her practiced smile. "A wise choice," Genevieve said softly. "Shall we get you into the gown?" The ivory silk gown settled over Aurora like armor. That was genuinely how it felt. The weight of the Brussels lace, the sweep of the silk train, The pearl buttons at the wrists, none of it felt like a bride's costume. It felt like the uniform of someone going into a very high-stakes and absolutely necessary battle. Aurora stood in front of full-length glass and looked at herself for a long, private moment, and somewhere deep in the complicated terrain of her interior landscape, she let herself acknowledge that this hurt the kind of clean, structural hurt that comes not from weakness, but from the particular loss of something you had genuinely believed in. She let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up her bouquet of white roses and turned to face the door. Lord Edward Ravenscar was waiting at the foot of the grand staircase, dressed in his formal morning coat, his white hair neatly brushed, his face carrying the particular expression of a man trying very hard to look only proud and not at all terrified. He looked up as Aurora descended. "Aurora," he said, and his voice did something complicated that he quickly controlled. "Don't you dare cry, father," she said quietly as she took his arm. "Not yet." He covered her gloved hand with his. "Are you all right?" "I am exceptional," she said. It was not entirely a lie. The carriage ride to St. George's Chapel was a procession through a city that had entirely embraced the fairy tale being sold to them. Crowds lined the cobblestone streets 4 and 5 deep, waving Union Jacks, tossing white rose petals under the carriage wheels, calling Aurora's name with the warm, borrowed adoration that the public extends to weddings and coronations and anything else that permits them to believe in something beautiful for an afternoon. Aurora sat in the carriage beside her father and smiled at every face she could see through the window. Inside the carriage, her right hand gripped the stem of her bouquet with absolute steadiness. Inside the carriage, her mind was running the checklist for the 47th time. St. George's Chapel in May was a cathedral of scent and sound. Thousands of white lilies had been arranged by a team of 12 florists working through the night, and their fragrance filled the stone nave with something almost overwhelmingly sweet and cool and faintly sacred. The light through the stained glass fell in colored shafts across the rows of silk and velvet, across the upturned faces of 400 guests who had come from every corner of the British Empire and several corners beyond it. Earls and countesses, American industrialists and European banking families, newspaper publishers who had built entire February issues around this wedding, a scattering of minor royals from the continent who had made the journey specifically for the spectacle. Aurora saw none of them. She kept her gaze fixed on the far end of the nave, past the column of flower arrangements, past the Archbishop of Canterbury in his full ceremonial robes, and settled it on the man standing at the altar. Lucien Vane looked extraordinary. He always did. Today he wore the full ceremonial dress of the Westland Dukedom dark navy in gold, his chest adorned with ancestral medals that his family had not actually earned in living memory, but which looked tremendously impressive under the colored chapel light. His golden hair was perfect. His posture was perfect. His expression, as Aurora came into his view at the top of the aisle, and the 400 guests rose to their feet, and the pipe organ thundered into a processional that shook the ancient stone, was a masterpiece of performed emotion relief and wonder and the specific quality of adoration that he had spent 6 months perfecting. He looked like a man who had just been given everything he wanted, which he believed he had. Aurora walked the length of that aisle on her father's arm at exactly the pace of a woman who had nothing in the world to be afraid of. She let herself look at Lucien. She let the expression on her face be everything the room expected it to be, soft and luminous and quietly overcome. She had never, in her professional life, executed a performance this difficult. She suspected she never would again. In the left transept, half concealed by a stone pillar, she registered the presence of a man in a plain dark suit, whose posture was not that of a wedding guest. Behind him, 2 more. Chief Inspector Thomas, positioned at the vestibule entrance. James Miller, seated in the 3rd pew behind the Ravenscar family, a leather document satchel resting on his knees with the studied casualness of a man who was absolutely not about to use it. 2 representatives from Coutts and Company recognized them, both seated quietly 3 rows further back, paperwork folded inside their breast pockets. Lord Edward placed Aurora's hand in Lucien's. Lucien's grip was warm. His thumb moved over her knuckle in a small, intimate circle, and he leaned in fractionally and murmured against her ear, "You look breathtaking, my darling." "And you," Aurora replied very softly. Look exactly like a man who believes he has already won." Lucien pulled back by a fraction. A single crease appeared between his brows, confusion, quickly suppressed, quickly replaced by the smile. He turned to face the Archbishop. The ceremony proceeded with the stately, magnificent slowness of a mechanism that had been performing this particular function for several hundred years. The Archbishop spoke of covenant and fidelity and the sacred weight of a vow witnessed by God and the assembled company. He spoke of two families joined and two lives intertwined. His voice rolled through the stone nave and up into the vaulted ceiling and pressed down over the congregation with all the authority of the Church of England at its most theatrical. Aurora stood perfectly still. Her heart was beating at its normal rate. She had occasionally surprised herself, throughout her professional life, by remaining calm at the moments that mattered most, and she recognized that capacity in herself, now, without particular pride. It was simply how she was built, and today she was grateful for it. The vows were exchanged. Lucien's were beautiful. He delivered them with flawless sincerity, his voice neither too loud nor too quiet. His eyes locked on Aurora's with the precision of a man who had practiced this exact performance in a mirror. Had Aurora not known what she knew, she would have believed every word. She delivered her own vows clearly and steadily, and did not embellish them. The rings were presented. Lucien slid the Westland family ring, an antique piece that had been in the dukedom's vault for 2 centuries, about the only thing in the vault that remained, onto Aurora's finger, and she permitted herself the smallest possible moment of acknowledgement that it was genuinely beautiful, before filing that acknowledgement away where it would not interfere with the next 2 minutes. The Archbishop of Canterbury raised his hands. His gaze moved across the congregation with the practiced gravity of a man whose office required him to take this particular moment very seriously. "Therefore," he said, his voice filling the chapel from stone floor to vaulted ceiling, "if any person here present can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together in holy matrimony, let them now speak, or else hereafter forever hold their peace." The silence that followed was the particular silence of 400 people who were absolutely certain nothing was going to happen. Aurora took 1 step back from the altar. She turned to face Lucien Vane fully, and she looked at him with a clarity that had nothing whatsoever to do with anger and everything to do with absolute, surgical certainty. "I object," she said. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then the chapel came apart. 400 voices broke simultaneously, gasps, exclamations, the sharp scrape of pew benches as people turned and craned and stood. The Archbishop's hand froze mid-gesture. A Vanderbilt daughter in the 7th row dropped her prayer card. Lord Edward Ravenscar, in the front pew, closed his eyes briefly, and then opened them and looked at his daughter with an expression that was not surprising. Lucien Vane went absolutely still. Every calculation behind his eyes became, for one unguarded fraction of a second, visible. "Aurora," he said, low and careful. "What is this?" "This," Aurora said clearly, for the benefit of the entire chapel, "is the legal termination of a fraudulent marital arrangement predicated on financial deception, criminal theft, and a premeditated conspiracy to cause my death." The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence entirely. James Miller was already on his feet, moving into the aisle with the document satchel open, heading for the Count's representatives. Chief Inspector Thomas stepped forward from the vestibule entrance. His 3 plainclothes officers moved simultaneously from their positions in the transept's calm, practiced, entirely, without drama. "Duke Lucien Vane," Chief Inspector Thomas said, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who had done this many times in far less comfortable settings. "I must inform you that on grounds of criminal conspiracy and financial fraud, you are—" "Wait," Lucien began. He did not finish, because across the chapel, 3 rows behind the family pew, Genevieve Montgomery had stood up. She stood there for one terrible, exposed moment, lavender chiffon, golden hair, wide blue eyes that had gone from performed joy to something much rawer and much more honest, and then she turned, as if she intended to simply walk out through the side door of St. George's Chapel as calmly as one leaves any social function one has grown tired of. One of Chief Inspector Thomas's officers reached her before she cleared the pew. Miss Genevieve Montgomery, the officer said with a respectful formality that, under the circumstances, had a faint dark comedy to it. I am arresting you on suspicion of grand larceny, specifically the theft of a diamond necklace, property of the Ravenscar estate, valued at £40,000 sterling. The officer reached for the edge of Genevieve's high lace neckline with one gloved hand, and there it was, the Ravenscar diamond, glittering cold and perfect against Genevieve's skin, entirely visible to 400 witnesses in the full light of a May morning, exactly where Aurora had known it would be. The sound that went through St. George's Chapel at that moment was not describable in any single word. It was the sound of a fairy tale reversing itself. Lucien made one last attempt. He turned to Aurora, and his voice dropped, and he used the tone he had used when he brought her orchids, and said her name like it was the only word worth saying. Aurora, please. Whatever you think you heard, whatever you believe, this is not what it looks like. Let me explain. I can explain everything. Aurora looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. I know, she said simply, and so does everyone in this room. She turned to James Miller, who had completed the escrow reversal documentation with the Couch representatives and was now standing at the edge of the aisle with the expression of a man who had just watched an extraordinarily well-executed legal maneuver and was professionally satisfied about it. He gave her a small nod. Every pound of the Ravenscar fortune was already moving back where it belonged. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, it was over. The society papers had their story a far better one than any wedding could have provided, with actual criminal charges. A stolen heirloom recovered at the scene. A duke publicly unmasked before the full assembly of the English-speaking peerage. The Telegraph had a correspondent at the chapel. The Times had two. By evening, the story was printed in every major city in Britain, and by the following morning it would be in New York, Paris, and Vienna. Genevieve Montgomery was taken to Scotland Yard in a police carriage, still wearing the lavender chiffon. She was formally charged with grand larceny. Her barrister appointed because she had, in the end, no money of her own, a fact that did not escape the irony of anyone who had followed the situation, entered a plea of not guilty that convinced precisely no one, given that 40 witnesses had personally observed the Ravenscar diamond being removed from her person in the middle of a cathedral. She was convicted at trial 6 weeks later and sentenced to 18 months in a women's correctional facility. Aurora did not attend the trial. She did not need to. Lucien Vane's situation unraveled with a speed that had a certain grim efficiency to it. The moment the escrow reversal was confirmed before Lucien had left the chapel grounds, the first of his creditors, who had been briefed by James Miller's contact at the financial district and were waiting with the patience of people who had waited a very long time, presented their claims. The ancestral Westland estate in Wiltshire was foreclosed upon within the week. The London townhouse, the one Lucien had inherited from his grandmother and used as his base of social operations, followed within a month. By July, the Duke of Westland had no estate, no income, no social standing in any room that mattered, and precisely the company he deserved, none. Criminal charges for conspiracy were being considered at Scotland Yard, pending the evidence gathered from Lucien's correspondence letters between him and Genevieve that James Miller's investigation subsequently unearthed, which were extraordinarily explicit about the planned riding accident and the timeline they had constructed around it. The case took longer to build, but it held. Chief Inspector Thomas had the satisfaction of personally overseeing both arrests. Lord Edward Ravenscar, upon learning the full extent of what had been planned for his daughter, spent approximately 45 minutes in a state of contained fury that required James Miller to physically prevent him from doing anything that would complicate the legal proceedings. After that, he poured 2 glasses of brandy, handed one to Aurora, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You should have told me. You would have stormed into the conservatory," Aurora said. A pause. "Yes," he agreed. "I would have." He looked at his daughter for a long time, and what moved across his face was something that had never quite made it into words between them before, a recognition, deep and mutual, that she was not simply his child or his heir, but something fully formed and entirely her own. "What do you need?" "Paris," Aurora said, "and then Rome. And then I believe there's a shipping contract in Hamburg that has been waiting for a representative of the Ravenscar Company for 4 months, and I intend to go and close it myself." Lord Edward raised his glass. "Then go," he said. She went. There were those, and there are always those who suggested, in the weeks following the chapel incident, that Aurora ought to take time to recover, to grieve, to rest, to allow herself to be sad in the dignified, private way that a woman of her station was expected to be sad when something this significant happened to her romantic life. Aurora had a great deal of patience for many things. This was not one of them. She spent 3 days at the Ravenscar family estate in the countryside, not recovering. She had never required a great deal of recovery time, but thinking. Specifically thinking about the fact that Lucien Vane, despite being publicly ruined in England, still had affiliations across the continent. Social networks in Paris and Vienna and Rome that had not yet received the full accounting of who he was and what he had done. Business connections in certain European financial circles that, without intervention, might simply pivot and offer him a quiet, comfortable soft landing somewhere nobody from London could see. Aurora found this unacceptable. She opened her leather-bound correspondence journal on the 3rd evening and began to write letters to the editor of Le Figaro, who had met her at an exhibition in Paris the previous autumn and expressed admiration for her father's shipping operation, to a countess in Vienna whose friendship with Aurora's late mother had been warm and long and who, upon receiving an appropriately detailed account of what had transpired, would ensure that every aristocratic drawing-room in the Austrian capital knew exactly who Lucien Vane was before he could introduce himself, to a banking family in Hamburg with whom Lord Edward had done business for 20 years, providing a precise and documented account of the attempted financial fraud, which they were welcome to share with whomever they deemed appropriate. She wrote 7 letters in 4 hours. She sealed them, addressed them, and instructed the household to have them dispatched by morning post. Then she went to bed and slept perfectly well. On the morning of the 4th day, she boarded the Channel train to Dover with 3 trunks, James Miller's private contact details, in Hamburg memorized, and a specific list of European cities, each containing a piece of Lucien Vane's remaining social or financial reputation that she intended to visit in order. She was not running away. She was not hiding. She was not, despite the well-meaning but fundamentally misguided suggestions she had received from various quarters, looking for a new fiancé. She was Aurora Ravenscar, daughter of an empire built on iron and refusal, holder of her own property under the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, a woman who had been targeted not because she was weak, but because she was valuable, and who had responded to that targeting with the full force of every legal, strategic, and intellectual resource available to her. She was also, as Lucien Vane was beginning to discover from the increasingly frantic letters arriving from his former social allies on the continent, extremely good at the long game. The revenge mission was not a thing of screaming or dramatics or public humiliation beyond what the chapel had already provided. It was quieter than that and more thorough. It was the systematic dismantling, connection by connection and city by city, of every network Lucien had spent his adult life constructing for exactly the purpose of surviving a catastrophe like this one. It was Aurora, in the finest hotels in Paris and Rome and Hamburg, over the finest dinners, in the most polished of conversations, simply telling the truth documented, provable, detailed truth to precisely the people whose opinion mattered most to a disgraced English duke with nowhere left to hide. By October, Lucien Vane had no continent left to be charming on. By December, Aurora Ravenscar had closed the Hamburg shipping contract, opened preliminary negotiations on a new steel partnership in Munich, and was sitting in a first-class compartment on a train bound for Rome with a glass of excellent Italian wine, a stack of investment briefings, and the particular quality of contentment that belongs exclusively to a person who has made something very difficult look very easy. She thought about her mother, sometimes. She thought about the diamond necklace, now restored to its velvet box in the Ravenscar vault, waiting for a day she had not yet decided on. She thought about all the ways the story could have ended differently with her on a horse in Wiltshire, with a fortune gone, with a woman reduced to a footnote in someone else's narrative. She thought about it, and then she turned a page in her briefing notes and moved on. There was too much to do. There always had been. That had always been exactly the point. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if this story moved something in you, if Aurora's courage made you sit up a little straighter, or Genevieve's betrayal made your jaw drop, or that chapel scene made you want to stand up and cheer, then I have done exactly what I set out to do. Thank you, genuinely, for watching, for staying, for giving this story your time. It truly means everything. Now I need one small thing from you. Please subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Smash that like button so more people find this story. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from right now. I would love to say hello to you. I want to know how far our stories are traveling. You are the reason we keep creating. Do not forget that. Aurora Ravenscar's story is not simply about a wedding that didn't happen. It is about what happens when a woman refuses to be the passive subject of someone else's plan. There is a lesson in her story that is as relevant today as it was in 1888, and the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 is its legal foundation, not merely its backdrop. For centuries before that act, a woman's property, her income, her legal identity itself, vanished the moment she signed a marriage register. Her assets became her husband's. Her name became a legal appendage of his. Whatever she had built, earned, or inherited ceased, in the eyes of the law, to be hers. The act changed that, and Aurora Ravenscar used it, along with her father's careful legal architecture, to protect everything she had built and everything she stood to lose. The lesson is this: financial literacy is not a luxury. Understanding the legal documents that govern the transfer of wealth, escrow covenants, property agreements, inheritance frameworks is not pedantry or excessive caution. It is the difference between Aurora walking free onto a Channel train and Aurora disappearing into a Wiltshire riding accident. Retain independent legal counsel. Understand every instrument before you sign it. Know what protections exist under the law, and use them. Surround yourself with the James Millers of the world, the steady, sharp, quietly loyal professionals who build the safety net before you need it. And finally, betrayal, when it comes from those closest to you, is not evidence of your failure to judge character. It is evidence that some people are extraordinarily good at concealing who they are. Aurora was not foolish. She was deceived by someone who had invested years in being deceptive. The difference between the woman who leaves that chapel in handcuffs and the woman who boards the train to Paris lies entirely in one thing. She did not break. Do not break. We will see you in the next story.